So that takes us to laws of learning. So these are some basic principles about how people learn things. And we start with readiness, right? So students acquire new knowledge when they see a clear reason for doing so. And an introduction of new information should follow a logical sequence. And use these teachable moments. So teachable moments are opportunities when someone is particularly responsive to something being taught. And teachable moments occur best when a student can clearly see how a new skill or information will help them in the real world. So this is why exercises are great. This is why working with external assets are great, because it gives your student an opportunity to really see something in context and to understand, oh, like this is why this is important, or this is when this would happen. But it's also why, and these, kind of teachable moments can occur both on purpose. You can create them as an instructor, or they can happen by accident. Most people, as pilots, as they go through their career, the EPs they remember best are the ones they've experienced in reality, right? If you've had a real compressor stall, if you've had a real, engine flame out, you've done a real single engine or a boost off landing, man, that one sticks right with you, because you really had to do it in a moment where, everything was happening, everything had consequence, and it just sticks right in there. So that, feeds into primacy, which is this idea that whatever is learned first is learned best. And students always remember best the things they learned first, and this can be problematic if the things they learned first were not correct. And this will lead to long stretches. I mean, sometimes even over the course of an entire flying career, the need to kind of go back and correct something like, oh, I did it this way that I learned it first, even though it was wrong. And so as an instructor, if you're exposing a student to a new concept, a new maneuver, a new technique for the first time, you have to make sure that you are demonstrating it and you're communicating it correctly, because the first time they see it, that is how students are going to remember it. So recency, that's things most recently learned or best remembered, and this probably isn't shocking to anybody, but the reality is if you're not using skills regularly, if you're not using knowledge regularly, it will fall back kind of in that recency timeline, and it's less effectively retained. So, the repetition, how long it's been, if you're taking a student out and it has been, 6, 8, 12 months or more since they've done something, whether that's single spot DOQs, whether that's night turf or some, certain fan maneuver. Hopefully it hasn't been more than a year, but the reality is sometimes, the last time you did autos was on your last NATOPS check. That's, that's problematic, and you want to kind of think about how that affects your students' ability to learn. And that brings us to exercise. So this, again, isn't going to come as a surprise to anyone, but practice is a significant factor in learning. Exposure is not enough. A student's opportunity to just see something is not really going to cement it. They have to get repetitions. They have to practice to build that skill or that knowledge base. Intensity, on the other hand, that's learning situations that create these vivid impressions, and this kind of connects to that readiness and those teachable moments, right? If you have things that really intense sequence, and that ties right back into whether those are real emergencies, real world missions, or even just really robust exercises, where students take a lot more from the event because of the intensity, because of the realism, and they're practicing something and it feels like, oh man, I'm really seeing how this is applied, how this works. And then lastly, we talk about effect. And this is, learning is about forming these connections with the material, and positive connections are much more effective than negative connections. So students who create positive connections with the material are much more likely to learn it. And so you as an instructor, you're trying to find those ways in which you can make the training enjoyable. You can make your student feel comfortable, try to make it fun. It should be fun. Sometimes it's hard, but that's okay. But if it's just suffering, And I do this a lot on events. I look at things and I say, hey, this student hasn't flown at night in 2 or 3 months maybe for some reason, and now we're going to go out on a 0 lux overcast night, maybe restricted visibility. We're going to do a form event. This is kind of stacking up against a student. This whole event is going to feel like pain and suffering for them, and the likelihood that they're going to learn as much from it is limited. Now, sometimes the reality of operations drive you to, this is the event that's happening and it's happening today. But then, a good instructor is going to want to try to put some things in place, try to find a way to mitigate some of those effects so that your student still kind of takes a positive feeling away from the event. And that brings us to memory. So all of these strategies and all of these metrics, the laws of learning and perceptions into insights, right? So all of these processes that are happening, your student still is now going to have to take this material and remember it. So some basic kind of neuroscience about learning, right? That we have these levels, so we can see kind of sensory, short-term, long-term, and this process of kind of moving back and forth. So this encoding stage, right, where we're taking these perceptions and we're kind of moving them back to long-term memories. And then there's a recall process where we take those long-term memories and move them back up kind of into that working memory, something that we can use in a real situation. So a sensory memory, that's that part of the memory system that receives that initial sensory information, has to be recognized and pre-coded. And that pre-coding is kind of this process of where we take something that we see and our brain automatically tries to kind of fit it into a pattern, fit it into things that we've seen or done before. And this can be good and bad. There are times where this helps us immediately recognize what's going on in a scene, but it can also force us into assuming, taking something for granted maybe, and not necessarily perceiving accurately the scene. But it's not really something that you have that much control of. It's really kind of an automatic process of your brain. And the thing with that sensory memory is that it's retained for a very short time before being passed to the short-term memory. And that short-term memory is only good for about 30 seconds, and short-term memory is kind of intended within your brain for immediate use. And it normally takes about 5 to 10 seconds for something to be taken into that short-term memory, and then it's only going to be held for a total of about 30 seconds. And studies have shown that your short-term memory is really only good for holding about 7 kind of bits of information at a time. But you can kind of extend this by grouping items into little clusters, and sometimes that cluster can be retained as an individual kind of one of those 7 or so bits of information, and you'll see that with things like phone numbers, where we cluster it up, we group it up, and it becomes much easier to remember, increasing the total amount of information that can be remembered. And then we're kind of working that coding process, right? That creating of those long-term memories. From that short-term memory, we're working into long-term memory. And a lot of studies have shown that one of the biggest ways in which those long-term memories are formed are when we have associations, right? The more connections, the more associations that thing that you're holding in your short-term memory has, the longer it's going to take root in there. Perfect example, right? Nobody remembers phone numbers anymore, but I can still remember, my phone number from childhood. Even a couple of my best friends who, from childhood, some of whom I haven't seen in years, 10 years or more, I can still remember the phone number for the house they grew up in, because it was so associated. So it's used and it's connected to so many memories and things from childhood that's really anchored in there, even when I have essentially no practical use for it anymore. And I'm sure if you think of your own experience, you can think of things similarly, where because they're so connected to specific stimuli, to events, and to other events in your life, it really gets coded in there in that long-term memory, and it stays for a long time, even if you don't necessarily have use for it. Whereas other things, I'm sure everybody's had that experience of trying to cram for a test, whether that's college, flight school, your NATOPS closed book, and you're sitting there and you're staring at the information and you're trying to, commit it to memory, you're trying to get it in there. Oh, remember this number, remember this number, remember this number. And then, you close the book, you go in to take the test, they put the paper down in front of you, it asks for that number that you were just trying to cram into your brain, and it's gone. It's nothing. And part of that is because you weren't really able to get it past that short-term memory. It went in there and 30 seconds later it's gone because you didn't take the time to really work it into long-term memory. And there's a couple of ways, strategies that we can help to increase the likelihood that something's going to be committed to long-term memory. And one of them is praise. People remember praise more than they remember criticism. And so this is, why it is important as an instructor to let your students know the things that they did well, that those things are going to stay with them, the things that they did well. If you give them that positive feedback, they'll retain it, they'll remember it, and that will help them along the way. Association, like we talked about, the more you can connect the things that they learned in this training event, in this flight, with other things, whether it's things from their life, previous flights, building on those experiences. And the other is motivation. If you don't want to remember something, you're less likely to remember it. If it's something that's really important to you, you're more likely to remember it. And as an instructor, where that fits in is helping your students understand what is important, what should they care about, where should those motivations come from. And then, like we talked about in the perception sense section, multisensory. You're much more likely to remember something if it comes from multiple senses, if it's connected. People have these intense memories connected with, the smell of, maybe grandma's cooking or whatever it is. These things that are kind of connected, multisensory, stick with you a long time. And that's why it's important to make sure that your students are gaining all of that perception, right? Pointing out, this is how it should feel. This is how it should feel in the seat of your pants. This is how the controls should feel. This is how it should look. This is how it should sound. Sounds of the rotor head spinning up, spinning down, loading and unloading. That kind of feel of higher G maneuvers, lower G maneuvers, onset of blades. All that kind of stuff can come really from those different sensory perceptions. And then lastly is just meaningful repetition, and that kind of goes back to that point at the beginning about trying to cram for that test, right? Trying to push that information in at the last moment. Those aren't meaningful repetitions. You can look, and kind of tell yourself, whatever number you're trying to get in there, 102.2 or whatever it is, and you're telling yourself 102.2, 102.2, 102.2, and then as soon as you get in, it's gone. Because those weren't meaningful repetitions. You didn't connect it to something. You didn't kind of build those building blocks. And then the other part of it is all the way back to that physiology. Like, in order to create and retain those long-term memories, you need good sleep. You need adequate hydration. You need stress management. If you're dehydrated and you haven't slept, and alcohol is a big inhibitor of memory formation, especially long-term memory formation. So if you spent the whole night studying and then you decided to cap it off by going out and having a good time, you're really kind of doing yourself a disservice there, because it's going to inhibit that memory formation. So the key is to wait to celebrate until after you've taken the test or your check ride or whatever it is, and all of those memories are properly formed.